The dust rose in slow spirals behind Mason's pickup truck as he pulled onto the gravel road leading to his family's ranch outside Prescott, Arizona. 5 years he'd been gone, chasing rodeo dreams from Montana to Texas, and in all that time, he'd never stopped thinking about Cheyenne Walker. She was there in every sunset, every lonesome highway mile, every moment when the crowd's roar faded and he was left alone with his thoughts. Now he was coming home, not because he'd conquered the circuit like he'd promised, but because his father's heart attack had brought him back to the only place he'd ever really belonged. He hadn't called ahead. Maybe that was cowardice, or maybe it was strategy. Mason didn't rightly know anymore. The ranch house looked smaller than he remembered, the white paint more weathered, the porch sagging just slightly on the south end. His mother's flower garden still bloomed with late summer roses, though, and that small constancy made something tighten in his chest. He parked near the barn and sat for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, gathering the courage he'd somehow lost somewhere between here and everywhere else. The screen door creaked open, and there she was. Cheyenne stepped onto the porch wearing faded jeans and one of those soft flannel shirts she'd always favored, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that caught the afternoon light. She stopped when she saw his truck, her hand frozen on the doorframe, and even from this distance Mason could see the way her whole body went rigid. 5 years hadn't changed her much. She still moved with that quiet grace that had first caught his attention when they were both 16, still had that guarded look in her eyes that suggested she knew how to protect herself from hurt. Mason climbed out of the truck slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted to. She didn't. She stood there watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between hope and wariness, like a wild horse deciding whether to trust an outstretched hand. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel, and with each step the weight of their history pressed down harder on his shoulders. "Cheyenne," he said when he reached the bottom of the porch steps. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "Your mama called yesterday," she said quietly. "She told me you were coming home. She asked me to look in on things while she's at the hospital with your daddy, so that explained why she was here." Mason felt something deflate inside him. For a moment he'd let himself imagine she'd been waiting for him, that maybe she'd felt his truck coming like she used to say she could, sensing his presence before he even arrived. But of course she was here for his mother, doing a kindness like she always had. Cheyenne had the biggest heart of anyone he'd ever known, which made it all the worse that he'd been the one to break it. "How is he?" Mason asked, climbing the steps. He stopped 2 steps below her, putting them almost at eye level. "Stable. Your mama says he's stubborn as ever, fighting the nurses about bed rest." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, there and gone like spring lightning. "You look tired, Mason. 5 years on the road'll do that." He wanted to reach out, to touch her arm, to bridge the terrible distance between them with something more than words. But he kept his hands at his sides because he'd lost the right to touch her casual and easy, lost it the night he'd told her he was leaving and she'd begged him to stay. Cheyenne turned and opened the door, holding it for him. "I made some coffee. Figured you'd want some after the drive." She walked into the house without waiting to see if he'd follow, and Mason stood there for a moment, breathing in the familiar smell of home pine and sage and something indefinably his mother, maybe her lavender sachets or the lemon oil she used on the furniture. Inside, everything was exactly as he remembered and completely different all at once. The same worn furniture, the same family photos on the mantel, the same blue gingham curtains his grandmother had sewn 40 years ago. But there was Cheyenne, pouring coffee into his father's favorite mug, and her presence here in this space where she'd once belonged so naturally now felt both right and impossibly complicated. She handed him the mug without meeting his eyes. "Your mama wants you to check the fence line in the north pasture. Side, there's been some damage from the summer storms." "I'll get to it tomorrow." Mason wrapped both hands around the mug, grateful for something to hold on to. "Cheyenne, we should talk." "About what?" She finally looked at him, and the pain in her eyes nearly knocked him backward. "About how you left without looking back? About how you promised we'd figure it out together and then you just went? Or maybe about how I waited 6 months for you to call, to write, to give me any sign that what we had meant something to you." "It meant everything," Mason said, his voice breaking. You meant everything. Then why won't you touch me, Mason? The words came out barely above a whisper. You've been home 10 minutes, and you're standing there like I'm a stranger, like we didn't spend 3 years planning a life together. When I feel my heart break for you again, when I'm standing here breaking all over again, just looking at you, why won't you touch me? The question hung in the air between them, raw and desperate. Mason set down his coffee mug and took a step toward her, but Cheyenne held up her hand, stopping him. Don't, she said. Don't touch me now just because I asked. Don't touch me out of pity or guilt or whatever it is you're feeling. She grabbed her jacket from the back of the chair. I'll come by tomorrow to check on things. You get yourself settled. She was out the door before he could form words, before he could tell her the truth, that he didn't touch her because he was afraid once he did, he'd never be able to let go again. Mason didn't sleep that first night home. He lay in his childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling he'd stared at 1,000 times before, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling around him, the wind rattling the old window panes, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill turning out by the water tank. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and another answered, their voices rising and falling in an ancient conversation. He thought about Cheyenne, about the way she'd looked at him with those wounded eyes, about the questions she'd asked that had cut straight through to his core. Why won't you touch me? The truth was complicated, tangled up in shame and fear and a love so fierce it terrified him. He'd left because he'd been 23 and stupid, because he'd thought proving himself on the rodeo circuit mattered more than the girl who'd loved him unconditionally. He'd left because his father had told him he'd never amount to anything if he stayed, and he'd wanted so desperately to prove the old man wrong. But out there on the road, riding bulls in dusty arenas from Cheyenne, Wyoming to Amarillo, Texas, he'd learned something his father had never taught him. Success didn't mean a damn thing when you had nobody to share it with. All those belt buckles, all those prize checks, all those moments of glory, they'd felt hollow without Cheyenne there to celebrate with him. He'd tried to fill the emptiness with other things, other people even, but nothing had worked. She was the ghost that rode with him everywhere, the memory that wouldn't fade no matter how many miles he put between them. Dawn came slow and pink over the eastern hills, painting the landscape in shades of amber and gold. Mason finally gave up on sleep and headed downstairs to make coffee. The house felt too quiet without his parents, too full of memories. He and Cheyenne had shared their first kiss in the kitchen, pressed up against the refrigerator after a summer barbecue when they were 17. They'd planned their future at the dining room table, spreading out catalogs for veterinary schools because Cheyenne had wanted to be a large animal vet, and Mason had promised he'd support her dreams the way she supported his. He wondered if she'd ever made it to vet school. There was so much he didn't know about her life now, 5 years of her story he'd missed while he was busy chasing his own. The thought made him ache with regret. By 7 o'clock he was out mending the fence line Cheyenne had mentioned, working with his hands the way his father had taught him, finding comfort in the simple rhythm of physical labor. The sun climbed higher and sweat soaked through his shirt, but he kept working, needing the distraction. He was wrestling with a particularly stubborn fence post when he heard the rumble of an engine and looked up to see Cheyenne's old Ford pulling up the ranch road. She parked near the barn and climbed out, and Mason's breath caught in his throat. She was wearing a sundress today, something yellow and light that moved in the breeze, so different from her usual work clothes that it threw him off balance. She looked like the girl he'd fallen in love with, the one who used to wear flowers in her hair and laugh at his terrible jokes. "Thought you might want some lunch," she called out, holding up a basket. "Your mama asked me to make sure you're eating." Mason set down the post-hole digger and wiped his hands on his jeans. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." She walked toward him, picking her way carefully through the rough pasture grass. "But your mama's worried enough about your daddy without worrying about you, too." They sat in the shade of an old cottonwood tree, the basket between them like a neutral zone. Cheyenne had packed fried chicken, potato salad, fresh biscuits, and sweet tea, all his favorites, though he didn't know if she'd remembered or if it was just coincidence. They ate in silence for a while, the awkwardness between them thick as summer humidity. "I'm sorry about yesterday," Cheyenne finally said, not looking at him. "I shouldn't have said those things. It wasn't fair. It was completely fair, Mason countered. Everything you said was true. I did leave without looking back. I did break my promises. He paused, gathering courage. But you were wrong about one thing. What we had, what you meant to me, it never stopped meaning everything. Cheyenne's hand stilled on the biscuit she was buttering. Then why, Mason? Why did you go? We had plans. We were going to get married after I finished college, start a life together right here. And then one night you just announced you were leaving, like none of it mattered. Mason stared out at the horizon, remembering that night with painful clarity. They'd been sitting on her parents' porch swing, the crickets singing their evening song, and he'd felt the words building in his chest like a storm. His father had been on him for weeks about wasting his talent, about how he'd regret it if he didn't at least try to make it on the professional circuit. And somewhere in all that pressure and expectation, Mason had convinced himself that leaving was the right thing to do, that he needed to prove himself before he could be worthy of someone like Cheyenne. My daddy told me I'd never be enough for you if I stayed, he said quietly. Said you deserved someone who'd made something of themselves, not just another ranch hand barely scraping by. I thought if I could make it big, win some championships, make some real money, then I'd be worthy of you. Then I could come back and give you the life you deserved. Cheyenne let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Oh, Mason, you idiot. She shook her head, and when she looked at him, there were tears in her eyes. I never needed you to be a champion. I just needed you to be here. I would have lived in a trailer and counted pennies if it meant we were together. Don't you understand? You were already enough? The words hit him like a physical blow. 5 years he'd wasted. 5 years they could have been building a life together. All because he'd been too proud and too stupid to see what really mattered. He reached out then, finally closing the distance between them, and took her hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back either. Her hand lay still in his, and somehow that was worse than if she'd rejected him entirely. I know I don't have any right to ask, Mason said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. But is there any chance you could forgive me? Any chance we could start over? Cheyenne was quiet for a long moment, staring at their joined hands. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. I don't know, Mason. I spent a year crying over you. Another year being angry. And the last 3 years trying to build a life that didn't revolve around waiting for you to come home. I'm not the same girl you left behind. I'm not asking you to be, Mason said. I'm asking if maybe we could get to know who we are now? See if there's still something here worth fighting for? Before Cheyenne could answer, her phone buzzed. She pulled her hand away to check it, and her expression changed. It's your mama. Your daddy's asking for you. They want you to come to the hospital. Mason stood, his heart suddenly racing with worry. Is he okay? She says he's fine, just insisting on seeing you. Cheyenne started gathering the lunch things. Go on, I'll clean this up and finish checking on the animals. Mason hesitated, not wanting to leave things unresolved between them, but knowing his father had to come first. Cheyenne. We'll talk later, she said, giving him a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Your family needs you right now. That's what matters. As Mason drove toward the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time, that Cheyenne was slipping through his fingers all over again. But this time he promised himself he wouldn't let her go without a fight. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and recycled air, harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as Mason made his way to his father's room. His mother met him in the hallway, her face drawn with exhaustion but relieved to see him. She pulled him into a tight hug, and Mason held her, feeling like a child again, wanting to make everything right but not knowing how. He's been asking for you all morning, she whispered against his shoulder. There's something he needs to say. Mason's father looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished by the wires and monitors surrounding him. But his eyes were still sharp when they fixed on Mason, still carrying that intensity that had defined him for as long as Mason could remember. Tom Hartley had been a hard man, shaped by hard times, believing that love was shown through criticism that pushed you to be better, stronger, more than you thought you could be. Sit down, boy, his father said, his voice rough but steady. Your mama, give us a minute. Mason's mother squeezed his shoulder and left, closing the door softly behind her. The silence stretched between father and son, heavy with years of unspoken things. Cheyenne Walker came by yesterday, his father said finally. Brought your mama some of her famous banana bread. We got to talking. Mason's heart sank. He could only imagine what that conversation had been like. She told me you were planning to stay on at the ranch, help out while I recover. Tom paused, his jaw working like he was chewing over difficult words. She also told me I was a damned fool. That brought Mason's head up. What? Said I'd been wrong to push you away 5 years ago? Said I'd cost you both something precious because I was too stubborn and proud to see what really mattered. His father's eyes grew distant. She reminded me that her own daddy died young, never got to tell her all the things he should have said. Made me think about what I might leave unsaid if this ticker of mine gives out for good. Mason sat frozen, unable to process this version of his father vulnerable, admitting mistakes, showing something that looked almost like regret. I was wrong, son, Tom continued, the words coming out like each one cost him something. I told you that you needed to prove yourself, that you weren't good enough for her if you stayed here on this ranch. Truth is, I was scared. Scared that if you stayed, you'd end up like me, working yourself to the bone, never seeing anything beyond these fence lines, always wondering what might have been if you'd had the courage to chase your dreams. Dad, let me finish. His father held up a hand. I wanted more for you, but I went about it all wrong. I made you think you weren't enough as you were, and that was a lie. You were always enough, Mason, more than enough. And Cheyenne knew it, even if I was too blind to see it. Mason felt his throat tighten, emotions he'd kept locked away for 5 years, threatening to break free. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought if I could make it big, win some championships, then I'd be worthy of her. And did you? His father asked. Did you make it big? I won some buckles, made some money, but mostly I learned that none of it meant anything without someone to share it with. Mason leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I lost her, Dad, and I don't know if I can get her back. Tom was quiet for a moment, his fingers plucking at the hospital blanket. That girl loves you something fierce. Always has, but love isn't always enough, son. You need trust too, and you broke hers when you left. You want her back, you're going to have to prove you're staying this time. Not with words are cheap. You have to show her with your life, with your choices, that she comes first. They talked for another hour, the longest real conversation Mason had ever had with his father. Tom told stories about his own youth, about loving Mason's mother and almost losing her because of his own pride. He talked about the ranch, about hopes he'd had that hadn't panned out, about regrets and small victories. By the time Mason left, something had shifted between them, some old wound beginning to heal. His mother was waiting in the cafeteria, nursing cold coffee. Mason slid into the booth across from her and took her hands. Tell me about Cheyenne, he said. Tell me what I missed. So she did. She told him how Cheyenne had worked 2 jobs to put herself through community college, studying business instead of veterinary medicine because the practical path had seemed safer after Mason left. How she'd started a small business making natural horse care products and organic cattle supplements. That had grown into something real, supplying ranches all over the state. How she'd dated a few times, but never seriously. How his mother had watched her close herself off a little more each year, building walls to protect a heart that had been broken. She's stronger now, his mother said gently, but she's also more guarded. You hurt her deeply, Mason, and I say that as your mother who loves you more than anything. But I love that girl too. She was like a daughter to me, and I watched her grieve losing you like a death. I know, Mama, and I'm going to make it right. Mason squeezed her hands. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to prove to her that I'm here to stay. When Mason got back to the ranch that evening, Cheyenne's truck was gone, but she'd left a note on the kitchen table. Fed the horses and checked the water tanks. Your mama called glad your daddy's doing better. There's lasagna in the fridge. Heat it at 350 for 30 minutes. See? Such a simple note, but Mason studied it like scripture, looking for meaning in every word, every loop of her handwriting. The lasagna was still warm when he found it, and he realized she couldn't have left long ago. He grabbed his keys and headed out, knowing where she'd be. The old swimming hole was exactly as he remembered, a wide spot in the creek where cottonwoods created a canopy of shade and the water ran clear over smooth stones. He and Cheyenne had spent countless summer afternoons here, swimming and talking and dreaming about the future. She was sitting on the flat rock they'd always claimed as theirs, her bare feet dangling in the water, her face turned up to catch the last rays of sunlight filtering through the leaves. "I figured you'd come here eventually," she said without turning around. "This was always your favorite spot." "Our favorite spot," Mason corrected, moving to sit beside her. He didn't touch her, respecting the boundaries she'd set, but he was close enough to feel her warmth, to catch the familiar scent of her shampoo, still the same lavender she'd used since high school. "I've been thinking about what you said," Cheyenne began, her eyes on the water. "About starting over, getting to know who we are now, and I've been trying to figure out if that's even possible. Can you really start over with someone who already knows all your secrets, all your dreams? Someone who's already seen you at your worst and your best?" "I don't know," Mason admitted, "but I'd like to try. If you'll let me." Cheyenne finally turned to look at him, and in the golden light of approaching sunset, she looked so beautiful it made his chest ache. "Why won't you touch me, Mason?" "You've been home 3 days now, and except for holding my hand once at lunch, you haven't tried. Are you afraid of me? Afraid of what you might feel?" "Yes," he said honestly, "I'm terrified. Because I know that if I touch you, really touch you, I won't be able to pretend this is casual. I won't be able to protect myself if you decide you can't forgive me. It'll hurt too much." "And you think it doesn't hurt me?" Sean's voice broke slightly. "You think I'm not breaking apart watching you keep yourself at arm's length? When I feel my heart break for you again, every single time I see you, why won't you touch me and at least let us both feel something real, even if it's painful?" Mason couldn't hold back anymore. He reached for her, pulling her into his arms, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest as he buried his fingers in her hair. She felt right there, like coming home after a long journey, like every piece of himself he'd lost, suddenly clicking back into place. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her hair. "I'm so sorry for leaving, for hurting you, for wasting 5 years we could have spent together. I was a fool, Cheyenne. The biggest fool who ever lived." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Promise me something, Mason Hartley. If we do this, if we try again, promise me you'll stay. Promise me you won't wake up one morning and decide the grass is greener somewhere else. Because I can't survive losing you twice. I promise," he said, and meant it with everything in him. "I'm done running, this ranch, this town, this is where I belong. It took me 5 years and 10,000 miles to figure it out, but I'm home now. And I'm not leaving again." They sat there as the sun set, holding each other in the fading light, and for the first time in 5 years, Mason felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work and careful courtship. Mason threw himself into ranch work with a dedication his father had never seen from him before, rising before dawn to tend the animals, mend fences, and handle the 100 small tasks that kept a working ranch running. His father came home from the hospital with strict orders to take it easy, which Tom Hartley accepted with about as much grace as a penned bull, but having Mason there to shoulder the load made the forced rest a little easier to bear. Cheyenne came by most afternoons, sometimes with food from his mother, sometimes with orders to fill for her business, sometimes with no excuse at all. They were learning each other again, discovering who they'd become in the years apart. Mason found that Cheyenne had developed a sharp business sense and a confidence she'd lacked before, while she discovered that he'd gained patience and a deeper appreciation for the simple things: a good sunrise, honest work, time spent with people who mattered. They moved slowly, cautiously, like two people who'd been burned learning to trust fire again. Mason would find reasons to brush his hand against hers when they worked together in the barn. Cheyenne would lean against him when they sat on the porch watching thunderstorms roll across the desert. They talked for hours, sharing stories from the years apart, filling in the gaps in each other's lives. Mason told her about the loneliness of life on the rodeo circuit, the emptiness of motel rooms and truck stop diners, the way he'd see couples together and feel an ache so deep it was almost physical. Cheyenne told him about the business she'd built from nothing, about the fear and excitement of taking risks, about the satisfaction of creating something that was entirely hers. "I almost called you 100 times, she admitted one evening as they walked the fence line together, checking for damage after a summer storm. I'd pull up your number and just stare at it, trying to work up the courage. But I was afraid you'd moved on, found someone else. Or worse, that you'd answer, and I'd hear in your voice that you didn't think about me anymore. Mason stopped walking and turned to face her. There was never anyone else, Cheyenne. I tried, once or twice, but it felt wrong. Felt like cheating, even though we weren't together anymore. You were always there, in the back of my mind, the measure I compared everyone else to. That's not fair to those other women, she said softly. No, it wasn't, which is why nothing ever came of it. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, letting his fingers linger against her cheek. You ruined me for anyone else. The day I met you, I was done for. They'd had their first real date the previous Saturday, dinner at the little Italian place in town that Cheyenne loved. It had felt strange and familiar all at once, like slipping back into an old, comfortable sweater that somehow fit better than it used to. They'd talked about everything and nothing, laughed until their sides hurt over shared memories, and when Mason had walked her to her door at the end of the night, he'd kissed her. Just once, soft and sweet and full of promise, and then he'd stepped back and said goodnight, leaving them both wanting more. You're doing this deliberately, Cheyenne had accused, but she was smiling. Doing what? Taking it slow. Making me wait, driving me crazy, Mason had grinned. Is it working? Yes, damn you. But the slow pace was good for both of them. It gave them time to rebuild trust, to prove through consistent presence that this time was different. Mason made a point of including Cheyenne in his plans, asking her opinion on ranch decisions, making it clear that her thoughts and feelings mattered to him. Cheyenne, in turn, began to let her guard down, allowing herself to hope again, to believe that maybe they could make this work. The whole town watched their reunion with interest. At the feed store, the hardware shop, the Sunday service at First Methodist, everywhere Mason went. People asked about him and Cheyenne, offering opinions and advice whether he wanted it or not. Most folks seemed pleased to see them together again. They'd been the golden couple once, the ones everyone predicted would marry and raise beautiful children and live happily ever after on the Hartley Ranch. Your daddy seems different, Cheyenne observed one afternoon as they sat on the porch sharing a pitcher of sweet tea. Tom was inside napping, but his presence was felt even in his absence. Quieter. More thoughtful. Near-death experiences have a way of changing a man's priorities, Mason said. We've been talking more, really talking. He told me things about his own father, about the pressure he felt to be hard and unforgiving because that's what his daddy was. I think he's realizing he doesn't want to keep repeating those patterns. That's good, Cheyenne said. Families need to break old cycles sometimes, find better ways of loving each other. She was quiet for a moment, then added, My mama called yesterday. She's planning to come visit next month. Mason knew this was significant. Cheyenne's mother had moved to Phoenix after her husband died, needing to escape the memories that haunted every corner of their small ranch. She'd tried to convince Cheyenne to come with her, to start fresh somewhere new, but Cheyenne had refused to leave. This place was in her bones, she'd said, and running from grief wouldn't make it hurt any less. How do you feel about that? Mason asked carefully. Nervous. She hasn't been back since we scattered Daddy's ashes out at Granite Peak. That was 4 years ago. Cheyenne twisted her hands in her lap. She wants to meet you. Well, meet you again. She asked specifically about you, about whether you were back for good this time. And what did you tell her? That I thought you were. That I wanted to believe you were? She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face. I'm trusting you, Mason. I'm letting myself believe in us again. Please don't make me regret it. I won't, he promised, taking her hand. I swear to you, Cheyenne, I won't. But even as he said the words, Mason felt a flutter of anxiety. He wanted to believe he could keep that promise, wanted to think he'd changed enough to put down roots and stay put. But there was a part of him, small and nagging, that wondered if the old restlessness might return. What if ranch life became too confining again? What if he woke up one day feeling trapped, desperate for the road and the freedom it represented? As if sensing his thoughts, Cheyenne squeezed his hand. Talk to me, she said quietly. I can see you going somewhere dark in your head. Whatever it is, share it with me. So he did. He told her about his fears, about the voice in his head that whispered he might not be capable of staying, that his history suggested he'd eventually disappoint her again. He told her about the dreams he sometimes had where he was driving away while she stood in the rearview mirror, getting smaller and smaller until she disappeared. "I'm terrified," he admitted, his voice raw. "Not of staying, I want to stay, but of failing you again. Of proving that voice right." Cheyenne was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. Then she shifted closer, taking both his hands in hers. "You know what I learned in the years you were gone? That I'm stronger than I thought. That I can survive heartbreak and come out the other side. I don't say that to hurt you, but to tell you this: I'm not afraid of you leaving anymore. If you go, it'll hurt like hell, but I'll survive it. What I'm afraid of is you staying when you don't want to, staying out of guilt or obligation, and both of us ending up miserable and resentful." "I want to stay," Mason insisted. "This isn't about obligation." "Then prove it," Cheyenne said simply. "Not to me, to yourself. Every day you wake up and choose to be here, you're proving that voice wrong. Every time the road calls and you decide you'd rather be here instead, you're building evidence against those fears. Eventually, the weight of all those choices will be heavier than the doubt." It was the wisest thing anyone had ever said to him, and Mason felt something shift inside him. She was right. He didn't have to conquer his fears all at once. He just had to make the right choice, one day at a time, until staying became as natural as breathing. They sat together as the afternoon faded into evening, watching the sky turn colors that defied description. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, and the cattle lowed softly as they settled in for the night. Mason thought about how he'd traveled halfway across the country searching for something he'd had all along, and how grateful he was for the chance to reclaim it. "I love you," he said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could second-guess them. "I never stopped loving you, Cheyenne." "Not for a single day?" She turned to look at him, her eyes shining with tears and something that looked like joy. "I love you too, Mason Hartley. God help me, but I do." When they kissed this time, it was different from the sweet, chaste kiss they'd shared on her doorstep. This was deeper, urgent, 5 years of longing and loss pouring into the connection between them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Cheyenne rested her forehead against his. "Take me somewhere," she whispered. "Just for tonight. Take me away from the ranch and the responsibilities and everyone's expectations. Let's just be us like we used to be." Mason knew exactly where to go. They drove through the gathering darkness, heading up into the mountains where the air grew cooler and the stars blazed brighter than they ever did down in the valley. Mason had packed a blanket and pillows in the truck bed, along with thermoses of coffee and some of his mother's homemade cookies. Cheyenne sat close beside him on the bench seat, her hand resting on his thigh, her head occasionally dropping to his shoulder. The old logging road was rougher than Mason remembered, but his truck handled it with ease. They climbed higher into the pines until they reached the meadow he'd been aiming for, a secret place they'd discovered years ago where wildflowers bloomed in riotous profusion and the view stretched for miles in every direction. Mason spread the blankets in the truck bed while Cheyenne stood looking out at the vista before them. The lights of Prescott twinkled in the valley below, while above, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of diamonds. She'd kicked off her boots and let her hair down, and in the moonlight she looked ethereal, like something from a dream. "I can't believe you remembered this place," she said as he came to stand beside her. "How could I forget?" Mason wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "This is where I first told you I loved you, right there, by that big boulder. You were wearing a blue dress and you had flowers in your hair, and I thought I'd never seen anything more beautiful in my entire life. I was so nervous that day." Cheyenne laughed softly. "I'd been in love with you for months, but I didn't know if you felt the same way. And then you said it, just blurted it out, and I thought my heart was going to explode from happiness." They climbed into the truck bed and lay on their backs, looking up at the stars. The night air was cool but not cold, perfect for cuddling close. Mason pulled Cheyenne against his side, and she nestled into him like she'd never left, like the 5 years apart had been nothing more than a bad dream. "Tell me what you want," Mason said quietly. "Not what you think you should want, or what would be practical. What does your heart want, Cheyenne?" She was quiet for so long he thought maybe she'd fallen asleep, but then she spoke, her voice thoughtful and sure. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to build my business into something even bigger, something that employs people from town and makes a real difference. I want to take that veterinary science correspondence course I've been looking at, even if I never become a full vet. I want to help your parents keep the ranch running, make it profitable again. I want children someday, maybe 2 or 3, running around causing chaos and filling that old house with laughter. She paused. And I want to marry you, Mason. I want to be your wife. Mason's breath caught in his throat. I want all of that too, he managed. Every single bit of it. I want to grow old with you, want to see your face first thing every morning and last thing every night. I want to support your dreams the way you've always supported mine. I want to be the man you deserve, the partner you can count on. He shifted, reaching into his pocket for the small box he'd been carrying around for 3 days, ever since he'd driven into Phoenix and found the ring. It wasn't the same one he'd bought all those years ago, that one he'd sold when money got tight in his second year on the road. Another regret to add to the pile. This one was better, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, because he remembered Cheyenne once saying that blue was more romantic than traditional clear diamonds. Cheyenne Walker, he said, sitting up and pulling her with him. I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know I broke your heart and wasted years we should have spent together. But I'm asking anyway, because I can't imagine spending the rest of my life without you. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend every day from now until forever proving that you made the right choice? Cheyenne's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the ring glinting in the moonlight. Mason, she breathed, is that a sapphire? You said blue was more romantic, he said, suddenly nervous. But if you'd rather have a diamond, we can— It's perfect, she interrupted, laughing and crying at the same time. You remembered. Of course you remembered. So is that a yes? Yes. She threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking them both over. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Mason slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. They kissed until they were breathless, until the stars above seemed to spin and blur. When they finally pulled apart, Cheyenne held up her hand, admiring the way the sapphire caught the light. When? She asked. When do you want to get married? Tomorrow, Mason said immediately, making her laugh. Your mother would kill us both if we eloped. She's been planning our wedding since we were 17. Then let's give her 6 months to plan. Spring wedding, when the wildflowers are blooming. We can get married right here in this meadow with everyone we love watching. 6 months, Cheyenne repeated, testing the words. That's not very long. I've already wasted 5 years, Mason said. I don't want to waste another day. They talked late into the night, making plans and dreaming out loud. Cheyenne wanted to combine their businesses, using Mason's ranch connections to expand her product line while incorporating sustainable practices that would make the Hartley Ranch a model for the region. Mason wanted to start a youth rodeo program, teaching kids the skills he'd learned while giving them a positive outlet and strong role models. Together, they painted a picture of their future that was both practical and beautiful, rooted in the land they loved and the community they wanted to serve. What about your daddy? Cheyenne asked at one point. Have you told him you're planning to stay for good? Not in so many words, but I think he knows. We've been talking about long-term plans for the ranch, things that don't make sense unless I'm sticking around. Mason paused. He asked me the other day if I was happy, just like that, out of nowhere. Are you happy, son? And I realized I am. For the first time in 5 years, I'm genuinely happy. Me too, Cheyenne whispered. I didn't realize how much I'd been just going through the motions until you came back and woke me up again. As the night deepened and grew colder, they burrowed under the blankets together, warm and safe in each other's arms. Mason thought about all the nights he'd slept alone in his truck or cheap motels, staring at ceilings and wishing for exactly this Cheyenne beside him, her breath soft against his neck, her trust given freely once more. Why won't you touch me, Cheyenne? He murmured against her hair, deliberately echoing her earlier question. When I feel my heart break for you again with how much I love you. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes soft in the moonlight. But I am touching you, she said, running her fingers along his jaw. I'm right here, Mason. I'm not going anywhere. Promise me, he said. Promise me that even when things get hard, even when we fight or disagree or drive each other crazy, you won't give up on us. I promise, Cheyenne said solemnly. We're in this together now. For better or worse, remember? We haven't said those vows yet. Then consider this practice, she kissed him softly. For better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. I promise, Mason Hartley. I promise too, he said, and sealed it with a kiss. They fell asleep tangled together under the stars, and when Mason woke just before dawn, he lay still for a moment, memorizing the feeling of Cheyenne in his arms, the sound of her breathing, the way she curled against him like she was made to fit there. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold, and Mason thought about how every sunrise from now on would be sweeter because he'd get to share it with her. Cheyenne stirred as the sun broke over the horizon, stretching like a cat before opening her eyes. When she saw him watching her, she smiled that sleepy, unguarded smile he'd fallen in love with so many years ago. "Good morning, fiancé," she said, her smile widening as she said the word. "Good morning, future Mrs. Hartley," he replied, loving the way her eyes lit up at that. They drove back to the ranch as the world woke up around them, windows down to let in the cool morning air, hands clasped between them. When they pulled into the yard, Mason's parents were already up, his father sitting on the porch with his morning coffee while his mother tended her roses. Cheyenne held up her hand as they approached, the sapphire catching the morning light, and Mason's mother let out a cry of joy that brought his father to his feet. There were hugs and tears and congratulations, his mother immediately pulling out her phone to start making lists while his father clasped Mason's shoulder in a rare show of physical affection. "You did good, son," Tom said quietly. "Don't mess it up this time." "I won't, Dad, I promise." The news spread through town like wildfire. By noon, Mason's phone was blowing up with texts and calls from old friends and relatives. Mrs. Peterson, from the feed store, sent over a casserole to celebrate. The pastor of First Methodist called to offer his services and ask about dates. Everyone, it seemed, had been waiting for this, believing in them even when they'd stopped believing in themselves. That evening, Mason and Cheyenne sat on her parents' old porch swing, the same one where he told her he was leaving 5 years ago, but this time was different. This time he was telling her about all the ways he planned to stay, all the roots he was putting down, all the reasons she could trust him. "I applied for the ranch manager certification program," he said. "Figured if I'm going to run the family business someday, I should know what I'm doing. And I've been talking to the bank about getting our finances in order, making the ranch profitable again so my folks can actually retire someday." "That's wonderful," Cheyenne said, genuinely pleased. "And I've been thinking, what if we turned that old barn on the South 40 into a production facility for my business? We could expand the line, hire some people from town who need work. Your mama mentioned that Jimmy Tucker's been struggling since the sawmill closed. He's good with his hands. He could help with manufacturing." They planned like that for hours, weaving their dreams together until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. This was what Mason had been missing. He realized not the thrill of the rodeo or the freedom of the road, but this sense of partnership, of building something meaningful with someone he loved. As the stars came out one by one, Cheyenne leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "Of what? That I'll wake up and this will all be a dream. That I'll be back to waiting and wondering and hurting." Mason wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "This is real," he said firmly. "I'm real, we're real, and I'm not going anywhere. Every day for the rest of our lives, I'm going to make sure you know that. Promise?" "Promise." The swing creaked gently as they swayed, the sound joining the chorus of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Above them, the Big Dipper hung bright and clear. The same stars their grandparents had wished on would be the same stars their grandchildren would someday admire. That continuity, that sense of being part of something larger and more enduring than themselves, filled Mason with peace. 6 months later, almost to the day, they stood in that mountain meadow surrounded by wildflowers and everyone they loved. Cheyenne wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly, with flowers in her hair like the day Mason first said he loved her. Mason wore his best suit and his grandfather's bolo tie, his hands shaking slightly as Cheyenne walked toward him on his father's arm. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, full of laughter and tears. When the pastor asked if anyone objected, Mason's father stood up, and for one heart-stopping moment, Mason feared the worst. But Tom just smiled and said, "I object to having to wait this long. These two should have been married 5 years ago." Everyone laughed, and Mason felt his father's blessing like a weight lifting from his shoulders. They exchanged the vows they'd written themselves, promises specific and personal. Cheyenne promised to challenge him when he needed it, support him always, and never let him forget how loved he was. Mason promised to stay, to choose her every day, to build the life they'd dreamed of together. When he slipped the wedding band onto her finger, his hands were steady, his voice sure. "I love you, Cheyenne Hartley," he said, using her new name for the first time. "I love you too," she whispered back, and then they were kissing while everyone cheered. The reception lasted late into the night, with dancing and food and toasts that ranged from sweet to hilariously embarrassing. Mason's college roommate told stories about how he'd moped around after leaving Cheyenne, while her best friend from high school reminded everyone how Cheyenne had sworn she'd never forgive him. "And yet here we are," she said, raising her glass, "proving that some love stories are just too stubborn to die." As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Mason and Cheyenne slipped away to the truck bed they'd prepared with blankets and pillows, the same spot where he'd proposed. They lay together under the stars, married now, their whole lives stretching out before them. "No regrets?" Cheyenne asked, nestled against his side. "Not a single one," Mason said, and meant it. "You?" "Just one that we wasted 5 years. But maybe we needed that time apart to appreciate what we have now." "Maybe," Mason agreed. "Oh, maybe I was just an idiot who had to learn the hard way that home was never a place. It was always you." They made love slowly, sweetly, celebrating the promises they'd made and the future they'd claimed. And later, as Cheyenne slept in his arms, Mason stared up at the stars and thought about how he'd searched the whole country for something that had been here waiting all along. In the morning, they'd drive to the small cabin they'd rented in Sedona for their honeymoon. In a week, they'd be back at the ranch, starting their married life in earnest. There would be challenges ahead. Money would be tight sometimes. His father would occasionally drive them crazy. The business would have rough patches. But they'd face it all together, partners in every sense of the word. Mason thought about the question Cheyenne had asked him what felt like a lifetime ago. "Why won't you touch me when I feel my heart break for you again?" He understood now that she'd been asking him to choose presence over absence, courage over fear, love over self-protection, and he had chosen. Every day since coming home, he'd been choosing her, choosing them, choosing this life they were building together. His hand found hers in the darkness, their wedding bands clicking softly together, and he brought her fingers to his lips. Cheyenne stirred, smiling in her sleep, and Mason closed his eyes, completely at peace. He was home, finally, truly home. And he was never leaving again.